Can the Catholic Church, the bride of Christ, be homophobic? According to one sodomy-supporting priest, she sure is. Homosexualist Jesuit James Martin is again in the spotlight, slandering the church. Here to explain the latest episode of that, Church Militant's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, what was Father James Martin doing in Lisbon for the World Youth Day celebrations?
Rodney, Father James Martin made a dramatic appearance at the World Youth Day, and according to organizers of LGBTQI+ events, he was the star, attracting the maximum number of young people for an event. And there were 2,000 people who came to hear him. And he was interviewed by a Portuguese liberal Catholic media, S.T.B, and he told this media company that the homosexuals and transgender Catholics in the church were like the man in the parable of the Good Samaritan who was beaten and bloodied and left by the side of the road. He compared homosexuals to Zacchaeus and the Roman centurion, and talked about how Jesus would go first and reach out to these utterly marginalized people in the church.
It's hearing that it's typical because they're perpetually playing the victim, while in fact, at least here in the United States, they're a protected class more and more, and people are getting punished for criticizing them in any way. It's really absurd. On what basis is Father James Martin claiming that there is a great deal of homophobia in the church?
Rodney, you stole my lines there, because I was going to say this is precisely what Father James Martin never talks about. The LGBTQ plus ideology is now not just protected, as you said, the people are a protected class, but the ideology itself is now the dominant orthodoxy of the day that brooks no alternative, and woe to anybody who dares to challenge this ideology. And to then turn around and claim that, we are the victims, we are like that man beaten and left by the road in the parable of the Good Samaritan. I mean, surely that takes some cheek. But this is precisely what the intersectionality ideology has done. It's turned the victim into the oppressor, and it's turned normal people into victims. James Martin very, very cunningly, as always, never tells us on what basis he's claiming homosexuals have been oppressed in the church. He doesn't quote studies, he doesn't quote statistics, he doesn't talk about history, but he just says that, there has been violence, beatings, and harassment against these people. Now, again, ironically, he doesn't talk about the fact that perhaps the only part of the world where homosexuals are thrown off rooftops are Islamic states like Iran. Yes, we know that in African countries, some like Uganda that are predominantly Christian, homosexuals are, not protected by the law. In fact, Uganda, as we know, has passed a law criminalizing homosexual activity. But even in these countries, legislators have done this precisely because they have seen what is happening in the Western world. The ideology has just begun to not just infiltrate, but take over people who just want to go about living normal lives.
So when he did this interview in which he accused the church, he slandered the church with this outrageous insult, was he asked how he reconciles his own homosexual propaganda with Catholic teaching?
Now, that's a very good question, because he talked about, how homosexuals are the scapegoats in the church. He then was asked about church teaching, and he, again, very disingenuously said, well, I never questioned church teaching. But in the very same breath, he went on to talk about how, well, 80% of Catholics reject the church's teaching on contraception and actively engage in contraceptive sex. Do we reject them? So he's using this, false analogy, this logical fallacy of, okay, if one thing is wrong, let's also just use that to justify something else which is wrong. And he then went on to talk about, he was, let me quote, he said, a growing number of church leaders more recently recognized that for many LGBTQ people, the church's teaching are a real barrier to feeling welcome in any way. Again, a straw man. Cardinal Robert McElroy, Bishop of San Diego, recently called for a change in the language of objective disorder, which many LGBTQ people have pointed to as a roadblock, something that makes them feel like they're in error. Now, obviously, he's talking about the language of the catechism, and instead of coming out directly and saying so himself, that he doesn't want this in the catechism, he wants to expunge it from the catechism, he's putting it in the mouth of Cardinal McElroy.
Well, coming up this October, we have the Synod on Synodality. He mentioned the Synod in this interview. What is he hoping the Synod will achieve for so-called LGBTQ people?
Well, that precisely, again, is what he was asked in the interview, and he said that he hoped that this language of objective disorder, he again puts it in the mouth of a young man who was working with the Synod. I met him while he was in Rome. He told me that about half of all the reports from dioceses across the world include a call to welcome LGBTQ people. Again, when has the church ever not welcomed everybody, irrespective of their goodness or their sinfulness? And Martin says it's a huge step forward, something that would have been inconceivable 15 years ago, and talks about how we need to listen to the voice of the Spirit, which, I'm not sure it's the Holy Spirit he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. This is so absurd. The fact that Father James Martin is allowed so much birth, he goes to all these big things. You would assume that some people are saying that, they're questioning if Pope Francis is aware of Father Martin's adamantly pro-sodomy agenda. What would you say to that?
Well, I think it is patronizing at best and insulting at worst to assume Pope Francis is so dumb. I mean, if he's so dumb, he would have nobody would have ever made him the Pope. But Pope splainers assume that Pope Francis is so dumb that he doesn't know what he's going on, that he's being manipulated, or misinformed or not properly informed by his team, when we all know here on the ground that it is he who very often does the manipulation and pushing around of people who are on his team. And then there is the other aspect of he's writing letters, very carefully worded letters to Father James Martin, repeatedly singling him out for this, writing in his letters about James Martin's ministry to LGBTQ people. So he certainly knows. And of course, then he's written personally to the dissident nun who was under censure from the Vatican, from Cardinal Ratzinger, from Pope Benedict, when he was Pope Benedict as well. We're talking about Sister Janine Gramick. And he's congratulated her, even though she's totally beyond the pale. So this sort of assumption, that Pope Francis doesn't know is really pathetic, because it's insulting to Pope Francis. And personally, if someone were in that position, they would feel hugely insulted.
Absolutely. But even though it seems like Father Martin may have the support of Pope Francis, what does Martin himself say about what appears to be the contradictory words of Pope Francis on homosexual relations? Because he's mentioned, things like a couple times that homosexuality is not good.
Well, the two are playing a very carefully orchestrated semiotic game. And, anybody in public relations would pick up on this immediately. I mean, people again assume that Catholics are so naive, they don't know what's going on. So, for example, when Pope Francis writes a handwritten letter in Spanish to James Martin, he will immediately get it translated, flash it on social media, on Twitter, and provide an English translation, send out pictures of him with the Pope. But James Martin is interpreting Pope Francis's behavior. And this is, again, what I've been saying in our Rome dispatches again and again and again. I'm using the word semiotics. It's not just what you say, but more importantly, your actions. And your actions interpret your words, or they give credibility to your words or clarify your words. So this is what he says in this interview. He says, it's first of all, it's a big church. Well, very specifically, Rodney, James Martin is asked about how come Pope Francis approved the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith's ban on same-sex blessings. And James Martin says, first of all, it's a big church. So, into footnote here, most probably Francis was half asleep when he signed it or did not know. And Pope Francis, like Jesus, teaches with words and deeds. So the support you show to various people in the LGBTQ community, whether it's a letter to someone who assists them, or meeting them, or even mentioning LGBTQ people in a homily or at a general audience, is a big step forward. This seems to be how the Holy Father is moving things forward in this area, step by step. In Italian, we say piano piano, more with gestures than declarations. And these have been a significant series of steps forward. And again, to those, Pope-splainers, why are they not willing to understand the semiotics of Pope Francis?
It's inconvenient for them, I think. Just shifting gears here at the tail end of this, only got a couple minutes here. A major incident is brewing with traditional Catholics protesting an LGBT mass at World Youth Day. You reported on that just a day or two ago. Can you bring our viewers up to speed on that?
Rodney, absolutely, because I've just heard from the organizer who put together these 12 traditional Catholics. His name is Rafael de Silva, and he's a very faithful young man. He wrote to me, he said, we protested not because we are against LGBTQ people, but we are standing against the ideology, particularly as it is infiltrating the church. Now, these people protested very reverentially. They were praying the rosary. They were making reparation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus at a parish church in a district of Lisbon during the World Youth Day, when a mass for sexual minorities was being celebrated. And the mass was, the priest presiding at the mass was a Dominican, former Dominican prior, and a Dominican who was lay-sized, quote-unquote lay-sized. But Pope Francis phoned him personally. His name is Father James Ellison. He's an Englishman in 2017. And he says, Pope Francis told me, I give you the keys of the kingdom. I give you the keys. And Father Ellison claims that Pope Francis unofficially rehabilitated him in the priestly ministry. Now, these 12 young people who protested, there was a grandmother there as well, by the way, they have been charged with disrupting religious service, and they might face up to 1 year in prison, which is, very, very shocking news that is just breaking from Portugal.
Yeah, unofficially putting this guy back in the good graces of the church is absolute hogwash. It was done officially. Something like that would have to be done officially with paperwork, with seals of approval and everything. So it's, the hallmark of the Catholic faith in these last 50 years has been nothing more than confusion, or at least confusion, and way worse than that. And priests like Father James Martin are allowed to preach his gospel, especially with the support of high-up prelates in the church. This is only adding to the confusion and alienating souls. Jules, thanks again for your update.
Thank you, Rodney.